couldn't make this up, could you? I mean, you really couldn't make this up. Calocane was a clear and present danger. He was hearing voices all the time. He was breaking into flats because he thought the voices were coming from the flat. At one stage, he thought his mother was being raped in a flat and he broke in. He was terrifying his neighbours. He was terrifying strangers. He was sectioned, allowed out, sectioned, allowed out, sectioned, allowed out. And then he went on to kill. I mean, it's indescribably incompetent.
And the family have said of the victims, the people in charge have got blood on their hands. He should have been in custody, or
he should have been in a secure psychiatric unit.
He should, because he was sectioned 4 times. There was a pattern of violent behaviour which was getting worse. He wasn't taking his medication, and that was happening repeatedly. And so he needed to be in a secure institution where he could have had his treatment injected into him.
And he was lying to his doctors. He was saying when he was banged up, basically, because he didn't like that.
But that's almost understandable. It's something that happens time and time again. I think one of the things that was highlighted, and Caroline, I don't know how you feel about this, it's something that carers and family members of someone with a mental illness have long complained about. Calocane said he didn't want the rest of his family to know anything about his diagnosis. As things stand, that's their right. But the family didn't hear the word schizophrenia even mentioned until after these dreadful, dreadful killings.
Yeah, and it's completely understandable that both, the families of the victims, are feeling distraught, and, we're obviously distraught before, but this just piles it on for them because of what they can see as the missed opportunities. For someone like this, of course, there's a whole number of people that might be involved, but some of the people who should be involved, Tricia, as you say, is listening to those who are closest to him, who see him in different environments to that which psychiatrists and the police see, and they are listened to. And I think that's such an important part of how we work with these individuals with extreme mental health conditions, because it's that piecing together of the fuller picture that can enable the services to do the best they can. But there's no easy answer for these individuals.
No,
this is a service area, to be honest, that doesn't get a huge amount of talking about. Quite rightly, we hear a lot about issues around anxiety, depression, and that's really important that that's being discussed more openly. But we don't really spend enough time talking about this particular group of patients and their needs, Karen, and how to deal with them.
But in this particular case, unusually, a doctor warned in one of the reports, Calocane could kill. Yeah. And that's unusual.
It is really unusual for somebody, a doctor, actually to write that down in a report. I was really shocked to hear that. Were you?
A couple of things struck me. First of all, I thought that doctor was very perceptive in predicting the future, because I would argue that up until that point, his risk profile was worrying, but it wasn't very concerning. So another way of putting that is that I've worked in criminal courts as a psychiatrist, and I don't want to alarm your viewers, but I would see dozens of patients every week that would have that low-level offending, low-level violence, and the vast, vast majority won't go on to do something as heinous as murder. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that I thought is the same as I think everybody else is thinking is, if that doctor genuinely thought that, why did they not act on it? Why was he discharged within a couple of weeks? How
difficult is it to assess someone like him when actually they're clever and they're quite good at lying? As I was going to say earlier, he didn't like being locked up, obviously, so he lied to his doctors, and he said that he wasn't hearing the voices anymore. He was. We know that because he told someone else when they let him out. But he lied, and lied convincingly, so they thought he was getting better.
So I think there's a couple of hurdles here. First of all, as you say, whether a patient is actually engaging, whether they've got insight, whether they're letting the medical staff know about their innermost delusions and intentions. So that's really difficult to do if somebody's, not playing ball. So that's one issue. But another issue is that you can get somebody well at the point of discharge. And that's not the problem. The problem is when they're in the community weeks, months later, when they start taking
the follow-up.
So they could be relatively safe at the point of discharge, but later on they become dangerous.
Sharon, I know they're going to be looking, the Labour government is going to be revisiting, hopefully, the Mental Health Act, which needs an absolute overhaul. But at the moment, the way the mental health services are, they're on their knees. You have to become more and more and more ill. We've had several incidents, many, many thousands. And, of course, we've got the Lampard inquiry coming up, looking into 2,000 deaths, from 2000 to 2023. But people go in and say, listen, when they do say, I am hearing voices, I am ill, you're not ill enough. Come back when you're absolutely... too far gone, and then you get these situations where people are acting out or taking it a step further purely to get a bed within a mental health facility.
And the number of beds have gone down, Trish.
Yeah.
Inpatient beds have gone down. And on the one hand, understandably, there's been big debates about, you know, actually why are people in some of these inpatient units, not necessarily with the conditions that this man has, but why are they there? There should be more community, and there's an argument for that. But the truth is, none of this is cheap.
No.
And it can't be fragmented. When someone comes out of an inpatient unit and goes into... we were talking earlier, there is a framework for actually community treatment. There are orders that can be used to ensure that the person does turn up and has to turn up and have conversations with their mental health support worker. But actually, it's still fragmented and it's under-resourced.
Yeah.
It's
Can
under-resourced.
we ask you this question? I mean, you work with these people, as you say, and you've seen some very alarming cases presented to you that you've had to treat. What's the takeaway from this report for you as a professional? What would you have done differently?
So I think the problem isn't that we don't have the safeguards. The safeguards exist. So Caroline mentioned there's community treatment orders, which is like a contract with the patient to take their medication. We have assertive outreach teams that will literally go to the patient's house and supervise them on a regular basis. So the problem isn't the systems don't exist. The problem is there's not enough resources.
Yeah.
So all of these teams are so overwhelmed and overburdened that they've got this pressure to try and discharge people as soon as possible because the waiting list is...
So does that mean that someone like you, I'm not saying you personally, but someone like you doing the job you're doing, is knowingly, because of that pressure, discharging the patient like Calocane, knowing that actually they're not quite right?
You don't... But here's the thing, you don't know. I mean, I'm biased because my late sister had paranoid schizophrenia, and we do have to say that you're more likely to kill yourself, sadly, and that's a failing of the system. But the fact is, and Caroline, you absolutely said it, the resources in the mental health system have been chipped away and chipped away. CAMS for teenagers, you know, getting in early intervention. You try and find a mental health intervention for a young person before they become, you know, taken over by the system. Hen's teeth, isn't it?
And for these particular individuals, you know, obviously the Labour government said they want to put more people into schools to support young people, and that's really important. But for these particular individuals, there is quite a complicated set of treatments and support that is required. That has to be personalised to those individuals, may involve years of inpatient, outpatient, community-based treatments as well. And it's going to need a lot more thinking about getting that right. I think we have the staff who are really committed in this area. Yeah. I think we have the framework. It's about the resources and reducing the piecemeal way in which some of the different services, like the police, operate as well with our mental health
But this has been
workers.
a Cinderella part of the NHS for years.
Oh, yeah.
Because
Totally.
I was just remembering... Do you remember when Jonathan Zito was stabbed to death on a London Underground station by a paranoid schizophrenic who'd been in and out of the system over 5 years? That was 30 years ago. Stabbed to death, failed by the system, and I don't think much has changed.
Well, and the truth is that, you know, in the last 18 months, with everything that's been happening, again, as in previous decades, it's the acute sector, the A&E, the waits there. You know, the push is then to prioritise getting people through the A&E. And at some point, you've got to think about, well, you know, where does that leave these services? And often it's not in the place they need to be in terms of the importance they have to our health and well-being.
Can I just ask you a sort of clinical question? When you're treating somebody who hears voices, which they are convinced are real. They know they're in their head, but they think they're coming from real entities, real people. Is there any point in their treatment when you're able to persuade them through medication or through some kind of counselling that actually they're not real? Or do they constantly think that they're real?
So my answer to that, Richard, would be it very much depends on the patient. So firstly, you can't detain somebody unless under the Mental Health Act unless there's a degree of risk. So an individual can be hearing voices, but if they're not, like, command hallucinations telling them to hurt themselves or other people, then you can't force them.
Sometimes the voices are nice and encouraging. They're not always bad.
Yeah.
And then part of the treatment, as well as the medication, as well as the antipsychotics, is psychotherapy. So the psychologist on the team will speak to the individual, and some individuals, once they've taken the medications and the voices go, they get insight. Other individuals, through talking through logically whether the voices exist or not, they eventually gain insight gradually. And unfortunately, there's some individuals who never gain insight. So it's a constant battle of relapsing and remitting medication, getting off medication.
Just on a human level, what would have been the reaction the morning after these terrible killings amongst the people who'd been treating him and who discharged him? How would they have felt?
I think they'd be absolutely shocked. They'd be questioning themselves. Did they make the wrong call? I alluded to this before, but I do think Calocane's risk profile wasn't actually that alarming before he did what he did. But I still think they'll be questioning themselves, absolutely.
Except that doctor did argue that he was a potential killer. So wasn't his risk profile more severe than perhaps normal? Because that is an unusual thing, isn't it, for a doctor to say?
It's a very unusual thing to say, but I don't know how the doctor knew that, because, as I say, there's so many other people. There's
but he was right.
Thousands of Calocane.
He did know.
But he did,
He was right.
It is a very, very complicated issue. But, as you say, it's got to be about resources and joined-up services, including the police.
Well, look, the National Director for Mental Health at NHS England, Claire Murdoch, has said this. CQC have identified unacceptable failings in the care and treatment provided to Valdo Calocane. Nationally, the NHS has already started work to enact all of CQC's recommendations, with every provider of mental health services reviewing the care that people with serious mental illnesses are getting. It goes on to say that they've also provided further guidance which instructs providers not to discharge people if they don't attend appointments, and reiterates the importance of sharing risk assessments with the partners and the patients' families, which, of course, did not happen in this particular case.
And if you've been affected by any of the issues that we've been discussing, you can find advice and support at itv.com/helplines.
OK, and of course the victims are, today as we speak, the people suffering because their families were the victims. And we're going to be speaking to Emma Webber, the mother of one of them, just after 8 o'clock. A very bleak morning for all of those families, having seen that panorama report last night and, of course, having seen the results of that report this morning. OK, we'll come back to that. Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. That was really interesting. Now, 12-year-olds being charged with rioting. What the heck is going on? How do we analyse that?
Well, I mean, it's not the first time we've heard of quite young children being involved in crime. But, I mean, honestly, this is just... It's so worrying about it, but also about, what was going on, I don't know, in terms of their families, where were they? I think for some of these kids who get caught up in this, but also, young people who get caught up in things like the county line stuff and everything like that, I know in a lot of cases the parents are doing whatever they can and these kids are being influenced by others. But I think those people who are influencing them in whatever way, and if there is a case here, it's a safeguarding issue, isn't it? It's a safeguarding issue for our kids. And I think these criminals who use kids and people who influence them to basically, be violent against police officers and others and public property, they should be held to account for this. Yeah. These kids are being held to account, but the people, if there are people behind this, they need to be held to account as well.
What about the parents?
Well, quite. Patricia will know more about this than me, but in America, wasn't her parents actually prosecuted for
violent for gun crimes?
Exactly, and
they gave their son a gun, didn't they?
And the parents were prosecuted. It made history in America. I'm not saying that happens here, but look, Caroline, 12-year-old boys behaving like feral youths, you've got to say, where are mum and dad?
But here's the thing, we're making assumptions that every family's like the Waltons. And that comes back to child poverty, it comes back to mental health services and early intervention, all of those sorts of things. And I think this... do you think that this is more indicative of what's going wrong at many levels of society?
Well, look, most children... young people are not out there doing this. Let's just put that out there. Let's just put that out there. They are not out there doing this. Most children are lovely. And, I'm not saying they aren't naughty sometimes, but they're naughty in what we would put in the sort of, parameters of what that's about. But when this sort of thing is happening, or where children aren't in school, there are so many children who are just not in school for a whole load of different reasons, missing education. Children, again, going back to, are there issues where actually, you need to work with the family? There are cases, and I've heard it, as an MP, parents who are tearing their hair out because they are trying to do something around their kids, especially when they go into their teenage years and what have you, and they just feel helpless. So I think there's a whole... How do we identify when things are going wrong? That transition, particularly when kids go from primary to secondary school, that's a pinch point in all of this. But clearly, we need to look at, in these cases, who are the adults who influence these kids? It may be an issue around the parents, but it may be an issue that actually it's others online. What are these kids seeing online and access to pornography, to violence, to tough talk? This is some of the things that, as a parent, myself, and my kids are all grown up now, but I feel for parents today, because how do they control that influence?
Absolutely.
And that's a safeguarding issue. It's a safeguarding issue.
And there were two of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Two of them. And deeply implicated in it, according to the prosecutor.
Oh, they
deeply
were
involved.
I mean, they weren't just hanging around on the fringes.
No,
they were some of the worst.
Yeah, they were some of the worst. Unbelievable. They're juveniles, so their names won't come out. But, I mean, this is going to blight their lives forever.
Absolutely.
Sadly.
Absolutely.
Look, it is obviously the job of programmes like this, and it's obviously the job of the opposition of the day to hold governments to account. But what do you make of Tom Tugendhat, who, of course, is in contention to be the Conservatives' leader? His attack on Labour and on Keir Starmer, particularly, over the way he handled the riots. He says that it was a complete failure, and that Starmer basically dropped the ball, etc., etc. Are we looking at the same page of news here? I thought that actually, whatever your politics are, the government did a pretty good job last week.
I don't quite know what Tom expected Starmer to do differently, and I don't know what the Tories would have done different if they were still in power, actually. Because, look, they got on with the important job of getting the police on the streets. Great to see police on the streets, because, let's be honest, people watching this programme don't see police on the streets. Great to see the police on the streets, and they moved swiftly with the court. Tough sentences. We're going to see these 12-year-olds sentenced.
And let me remind the viewers, this is a Daily Mail writer.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I've got issues whether there's another whole question about. I don't think Starmer's got to talk about at some point some of the underlying issues in some of these towns, not justifying any of the violence, but actually, I think on balance, it wasn't a failure of Keir Starmer.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because my sense is if it was the other way around, flip it the other way around, I just don't think if, Keir Starmer was in opposition now and this happened on the Tories' watch, he would be making accusations like that.
Doesn't it depend on whether there's a whole kerfuffle about leadership?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, in this? I mean, Tom Tugendhat, who's seen as on the sort of liberal side of the... or used to be.
Why do you look at me when you use the word liberal?
On the liberal side of the Conservative Party is literally doing a full,
I thought
100
this morning.
360.
Exactly what I thought.
And this is what this is about. This is them sparring within the membership for votes, trying to say, I can land something on the government. I think, really, it's not just that the police were out on the streets. I mean, the courts were operating. I mean, at the end of all this, I think actually what's might be happening is the public will say, if we could do that this summer, why can't we have that all the
That's
time?
exactly what
That's exactly what people say.
Why can't we have the courts operating like this all the time?
And why
for
can't we see
shoplifters and other people and all
why can't we
that?
see more police on the streets?
And why didn't the previous government do the same thing?
Well,
Exactly.
I got a lot of feedback yesterday from what I said on the programme. I was looking back to my days as a court reporter, as a young journalist, We're going back 50 years, almost.
Never.
Yeah, I'm afraid so, yeah.
When Pharaoh sat in court.
And this delay in prosecutions was simply not on the agenda. It didn't happen. Criminals, when they were caught, were charged promptly, and they appeared in court usually within days, never mind years.
But there wasn't the backlog that there is now.
No,
we
know why it's happening.
Starmer's learned from the 2011 riots when Cameron was Prime Minister. He was Director of Public Prosecutions, and back then they opened the courts at night, at weekends. It was swift justice. And Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions at the time. So it was almost the same strategy, which worked in 2011, although those riots were more serious because 5 people died.
And isn't it...
And there was more looting.
And isn't it helpful to know that, he has got that experience? So it's not just rhetoric.
No.
It's actually practicalities. What do we need to do?
He put his hand on the levers of power last week and he pulled them in the right direction.
I mean, I don't think the language used was particularly inspiring. I don't think he's never going to be a great speaker, is he? Let's be honest.
Don't care about that, really.
No, as long as he does
get things done.
And the riot stopped.
Yeah.
So I just again, when I read what Tom Tugendhat said, I said, Where have you been? Were you on holiday? Or...
Yes, exactly. It was a ridiculous attack. It's got no traction in it at all.
No.
Zelensky seems to be doing pretty well in his invasion of Russia. I mean, initially it was thought it was a tactical strike and they'd come back, but he's bedding in for the long haul.
You don't think it's scary?
Do I think it's scary? No, I think it's... no, not scary. No, I don't. I think that it's necessary.
You don't think he's poking the bear?
Well, no, I think
he's poked the bear already.
But also, he's taking the war into Russia in the same way Russia has taken it into Ukraine. And Russian people are being evacuated. They are now finally feeling what war is, because actually it's been Ukraine that's being bombarded. And this is going to damage Putin. It's an extraordinarily courageous move by the Ukrainian forces, and I hope it means if Trump wins the election that he's going to continue to support Ukraine, because
partly why Zelensky's done it.
Exactly why he's doing it now,
exactly.
because they have taken a lot of Russian territory. It's really important, and they're massively outnumbered. But it's, I think.
But they're still asking the UK, aren't they, for permission to use those long-range weapons.
Storm Shadow.
And the US as well. The US is saying no. The UK, it's not just the UK's decision; it's France as well. But isn't there that fear that Britain or, you know, the United States could be dragged into that? And what's happening in the Middle East?
I think the fear is fatigue, and I think that's why he's got stuck in Zelensky, that voters in countries all around the world will think, how much more money are we going to give to this country?
Well, that's what Donald Trump, that's what Donald Trump's saying.
So I think by doing this audacious move...
And also, I think...
Hang on, can I just ask you, to pick up what Patricia was saying there, what do you think we should do as a country, along with the French? I mean, we build Storm Shadow together. Zelensky wants to use them long-range deep into Russian territory, striking at power centres, at administration centres, at railheads, airfields and all the rest of it, deep in Russian territory. But he can't do it unless we say yes. Should we say yes?
I think we should. That's what he needs to do.
What do you think?
Well,
it's not going to trigger a conflict with NATO. It's not.
I think as long as it keeps within the sort of those rules as much as you can as a member of NATO, I think, you know, you're going to have to support that. The arms are in the hands of Zelensky and the Ukrainians. It will not be members of NATO who will be steering them. So therefore, you know, we're providing the weapons. It's for them. But I think, you know, you can't underestimate, I think, in this as well, the impact on the psyche of the Russians around us.
Well, it's the first time they've been invaded since the Germans invaded in 1942.
Exactly. I mean, you know, it's all been about, let's be honest, with Crimea and the other into the Donetsk and other areas from Russia. It's all about them going forward. Now it's coming pushed back. And, you know, it's very difficult, I think, probably for Russians to voice concern. There are some who are doing that. But the more pictures there are of Russians being taken prisoner of war by the Ukrainians, it's a massive dent to pride. And that's massive for Putin.
Now, look, the big question of the day, obviously, is should you snog a dog?
No!
because we've seen these pictures of this dog being kissed, and it just sort of turns the stomach. Do you have a dog?
I did have a dog. He sadly passed, but and I loved him to bits.
Did you kiss him on the lips?
No. You know, who knows where those dog lips have been?
I think we do know exactly where they've been.
Have you ever had a dog?
No, I haven't, and I wouldn't. But I've got 2 cats, and I wouldn't kiss cats in the face either.
No. Anyway, are you saying you would kiss an animal somewhere else other than
no kissing?
No kissing. No. Why do we have this whole thing about dressing dogs up and turning animals into baby human beings?
I know, it's weird.
But I have to say, we're getting quite a few messages from people who are saying that they do it. It is, and they think that their dogs enjoy it. So please keep those stories coming.
You don't see dogs kissing each other.
On the lips.
No. Well, you see them kissing not on the lips, but
hence why you don't kiss them in the face.
Right, and if you take the dog for a walk and it meets another dog, where do they go straight away?
I know.
Where do they stick their tongues?
I know.
Oh,
you know?
please!
Come on,
Have we had our breakfast yet?
Yeah.
Well,
this is really getting rough.
And actually, if you be honest, if you have done it and then you've got ill, you know, like later that day you've had an upset stomach, then tell us about that too, because it must happen.